that's not a job-winning approach. So it's a beautiful, expressive color, which has its place from the highest instrument, the piccolo trumpet, down to even at times a B-flat tuba, if they're playing solo literature, which says con espressivo. But it's something that needs to be understood, that it's more an individual, soloistic tone. It has to be used applicably. So if you're playing, for example, a Baroque piece that says espressivo, you don't want it to sound like you're playing a slow jazz ballad. Similarly, if you're playing a vocal piece, an operatic piece, an operatic aria, Puccini or something, you don't want it to sound, like you're playing an old folk song, or something you play in a classical piece. So you need to think how, obviously know how you create it. The worst thing a brass player can do is make vibrato and have no idea how it's made or how it's controlled. That means it's just kind of there all the time. And that's when teachers quite rightly can say, okay, I want you to play this without vibrato. It's almost like taking a steroid pill, to fix all the ails in the body for a while. Just get rid of it. In ensemble playing, it depends what you're playing. If you're playing an Oscar Bone, sextet, where everybody has singing lines, even the trumpets, I would expect to use a little bit of singing vibrato. I would expect that the euphonium part, when it's a bass part, would use less. When it is a melodic, expressive line, I'd expect it to use more. In the orchestral world, if you're playing, the planets or Strauss or any of those important works, your job usually is to function alongside the tuba and with the trombone section, and occasionally as a solo voice. And in the occasionally as a solo voice, you can characterize it, especially in the case of Don Quixote, where you're, this jovial character. I'd have no problem using a little bit of vibrato there. I think what upsets people, and this is something I find a lot, is that most euphonium players in the States and around the world tend to be taught by trombone and tuba teachers who've earned their stripes, usually in an orchestra. And so they have pretty set views about the role of vibrato and don't quite encompass the fact that the euphonium as a lyrical tenor instrument with its own repertoire, which features a lot of cantabile things that we do well, the euphonium should be allowed to cultivate a range of vibrati which are suitable for that literature. And so very often I find people playing pieces using no vibrato. And of course the question is, why are you using no vibrato? My teacher says it's better that I don't use it. Why? I don't know. Is he a trombone player? Yes, he plays in the orchestra. Okay, so I want to phone up that teacher and have a chat with them. But to some extent, it's the reality. I'm not going to be able to do that every time I hear that instance go on. Euphonium players in brass bands, who then transfer and try and do other things, often find that they take their brass band vibrato with them. And that's equally a problem. I've heard orchestras where they got the brass band guy to go in to play that, hunting theme from Mars. And so, we need to be responsible to know what sound is applicable, just as teachers who teach it need to know that the euphonium characteristic vocal sound should be allowed to include vibrato as one of its expressive elements. How am I doing so far? Any other follow-up questions to that? In chamber music, again, it depends what it is. If you're playing, with French horn and two trumpets, I would use probably very little vibrato, unless I had a solo that said molto cantabile, molto espressivo, then I would feel that that's my traditional domain. If you play in a wind orchestra, essentially 95% of the time your job is to blend and occasionally, take a line from the French horn or blend with the tenor saxophones and double the tuba. You'd be crazy to think that a singing lyric vibrato coming throbbing through the band is what either the conductor or the composer would ever imagine. But for example, when you're playing Holst, British music, Holst was very familiar with brass bands. He knew when he wrote the euphonium part in his suites, he knew what the euphonium in a brass band would sound like, and he would expect some vibrato. sense of it if they think it's going to be mauled by vibrato. But in some countries, you know, without that euphonium brass band tradition, you would quite naturally expect that the composer would imagine less vibrato. So I think we have a responsibility to be aware of how we should use it, but at the same time, be brave enough that when you think the occasion is right, don't feel that somehow it's embarrassing or somehow wrong that you are using vibrato. So I think the responsibility for us is to be open-minded and have great historical perspective and stylistic perspective of how it should be applied.
Okay. I feel it's the mechanics are not the difficult part, it's the concept.
For some people it is the mechanics that's difficult, but usually the concept. So I mean I see a lot of people who are using vibrato because it's euphonium and I think it's okay, who are basically playing everything from here